there's been talk about voter fraud in this country for a long time. In terms of the big picture, before we get to the Kovac Commission, how serious a problem is voter fraud in the United States?
If by voter fraud is meant people pretending they're someone other than themselves and voting, it's not a problem at all. It is non-existent. Study after non-existent in any kind of widespread. Sure, you can find one or two cases. Good example. I litigated the Texas photo ID case.
Yes.
In the 10 years leading up to the passage by the Texas legislature of the most restrictive photo ID law in the country, out of 20 million votes cast in Texas, there were 2 instances of the sort of in-person fraud that a photo ID law could stop. And these 2 instances were, by the way, they were caught. Mm-hmm. One was a guy who voted on behalf of his father who just died. They had the same name. And the other was this genius, apparently, who voted, went back to the same polling station later in the afternoon, voted again on behalf of his brother who was incarcerated at the time. That's it. 2 out of 20 million votes cast, and the equation that's used by people who are using fraud as a means to enact suppressive laws such as strict photo ID laws is that they're willing to stop maybe 2 out of 20 million instances in exchange for suppressing tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of votes, primarily minority voters.
And disenfranchising them.
Disenfranchising them. That's correct.
Right. And that's the price of it. I saw that Allison Grimes, yesterday, the Secretary of State for Kentucky, mentioned that and we saw this a few years ago. I don't know how many states voter suppressive laws for suppression laws introduced through a lot of them through the American legal ALEC, American legal.
ALEC is reputed to have been behind the drafting of some of these laws.
Right. But so anyhow, just to finish that, Allison Grimes just said, I heard her say yesterday that there are some 89 laws circulating today in some 30 states along the same lines.
And the sad part of that is these laws are going to be able to go into effect immediately if they're passed and signed by their governors. But that wasn't the situation 4 years ago when we had Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act in effect. And the United States Supreme Court gutted that law because in states that had a proven record of discrimination, they could not enact laws like that and implement them without getting approval of either the Attorney General or a 3-judge court in the District of Columbia.
Right. So that break that existed, like putting on the brakes in those particular states, is gone right now. So
not only are the brakes gone, we don't even know if the accident is happening all the time. Because in the past, the states and the counties and the cities could not make any change that changed voting requirements in these covered jurisdictions without getting approval. So, for example, they could not consolidate voting districts, which they're doing. And you don't always find out about that in some small areas unless you have feet on the ground or someone calls calls our hotline, for example. So it's a tough situation since the Shelby decision by the Supreme Court.
I think the toughest one for a lot of people to accept is the voter ID. I mean, you hear the argument, and it sounds so simple. Well, look, everybody's got his driver's license. I mean, you can't get in a federal building here unless you show a photo ID. So why shouldn't you have to show a photo ID to vote?
Right. And I have that same discussion with my friends. And then after I tell them this, that first of all, it's not just any ID, which is the sort of thing you could use to get into a courthouse. It's, for example, in Texas. Before the Texas law was enacted, they had an ID law. You had to show either a voter registration card, which everyone had because it was sent to them by the election officials, or a bank statement, a driver's license, utility bill, government checks, a whole bunch of things that are pretty reliable. Despite having no evidence of fraud, the Texas legislature passed a law that limited to just a Texas driver's license, not any driver's license, a passport, a military ID, naturalization card, or it being Texas, a license to carry. And they also said, we're going to give everyone a free photographic election identification card, but in order to get that, you had to go to your motor vehicle station. And believe it or not, 1/3 of the counties in Texas do not have a motor vehicle facility. And Texas is a pretty big state. And people who are poor, who are working for hourly wages, can't take off from work, have family responsibilities, don't have cars because they don't have a driver's license, they'd have to travel maybe an hour and a half taking off from work to get these things. You know, it's different for people. It's easy for me. It's not easy for people who are poor and they are disproportionately minority citizens, and that's the evil of these laws.
Right.